Good afternoon. If you're just tuning in, welcome to APAC's Legislative Leadership Summit. I'm Madeleine Milka, President and CEO of APAC's, the Asian Pacific American Institute for Congressional Studies. Thank you for joining us. As a reminder, please be sure to check out the exhibitor booths as a part of this summit. Really great information from all of our wonderful sponsors who have been so supportive in putting together these panels with us. Today, we are going to talk about the topic of the tech industry and building the STEAM pipeline. I'd like to thank our partners for this event, Entertainment Software Association and Google, for sponsoring this panel today. Before we begin, it's my pleasure to introduce Congressman Ro Khanna for opening remarks. Congressman Khanna represents California's 17th Congressional District and is focused on creating new tech jobs across the country, particularly for Americans left behind, and investing in science and technology to win the 21st century. Prior to serving in Congress, Congressman Khanna taught economics at Stanford University, law at Santa Clara University, and American jurisprudence at San Francisco State University. Please give a warm welcome to Congressman Khanna.
Hi, it's Congressman Ro Khanna. As a representative of Silicon Valley, I'm so proud of Apex for having this important panel and conversation about the leaky pipeline. This is an issue that affects not just Asian Americans, but Black Americans and Latino Americans and women. Tech has to do better in seeing that we have talent in many communities, in rural communities, in communities left behind, in communities of color that can contribute. And with the Asian American community, the representation has to be more, not just with the Indian American or Chinese American community, but with the Filipino community, the Vietnamese community. We're not a monolith. And then there's the question of leadership. Yes, we've had some great successes with Satya Nadella and Sundar Pichai, but the reality is that Asian Americans, Black Americans, Latino Americans still are not at the highest levels of venture capital boards and executive positions to the extent that they should be. While some have broken these barriers and provide hope, we still have to do better for broad-based inclusion so that everybody has an opportunity to participate and lead in the digital economy. Thank you, Apex, for your leadership, and I'll look forward to your recommendations.
Thank you, Congressman Khanna, for joining us today. It's now my pleasure to introduce Janny Lau as the panel's moderator. Janny is the current vice chair of the Asian American Advisory Council within the Comcast NBC Universal Joint Diversity Advisory Council, the JDC. Comprised of national leaders in business, politics, and civil rights, the JDC provides advice to senior executives at Comcast and NBC Universal regarding the development and implementation of diversity, inclusion, and social justice initiatives. We're excited to have her today. Welcome to the panel.
Thank you, Madeleine. I'm so honored to moderate our distinguished panel. At this time, I'd like to welcome them, and I'll introduce each of them by name and title, and then invite each of them to spend about a minute each to give us a fuller introduction of their role and their organization, and anything else from their biography that they think might be relevant with respect to the perspective that they're bringing to the panel today. So first, we have Hiro Tachibana, who is the Vice President and General Counsel at Capcom USA. Hiro?
Hi, good afternoon. I'm very honored to be invited to be on this panel for the opportunity to share my own Asian American story. I serve as Vice President and General Counsel of Capcom USA, which is an American division of Capcom, a Japanese video game company that operates all over the world. Some of the most famous games that you may have heard of are Street Fighter, Resident Evil, and Monster Hunter. Capcom is a member of ESA, sponsor of this panel discussion, ESA, Entertainment Software Association, which serves as the voice and advocate for the video game industry. I grew up in Japan until the middle of high school, and then moved to the United States as a foreign student to pursue a STEM-based education in high school and college. And then I pivoted to the study of law, and ever since I pursued a legal career in the video game and high-tech industries. I feel very fortunate to be, I feel very blessed to have the opportunity to pursue a legal career, follow my passion in the intersection of law, video game, law, liberal arts, technology, and entertainment. Now I will hand over mic to our co-panelist, Kwan Vū.
Thanks, Hiro. Thanks, Madeline. Thanks, Representative Khanna, and our moderator, Janie. My name is Khánh Vū. I am the Society of Asian Scientists Executive Director and CEO. We're a relatively young organization, but we've grown pretty quickly. The Society of Asian Scientists and Engineers, SASE for short, represents over 100 chapters across the United States. We have over 100 sponsors. And our mission really is to support the STEM talent pipeline, whether that it's in college or professional, and tackle those issues of, as the representative mentioned, leadership. Really, how do we bring those skill sets and awareness to the Asian population and also to the broader STEM community of what Asian leadership brings to the table? And so I'm really happy to be on this panel, and I'll hand it over to Yul there.
Thanks, Kwan. Hi, everyone. My name is Yul Kwon. Currently work at Google, where I'm a Senior Director of Product Management and also Chief of Staff to our Chief Legal Officer and Head of Global Affairs. So really want to thank APAC's Madeline, Representative Khanna for hosting this event, and all of my co-panelists, and Janie, thanks so much for moderating. Yeah, I don't have too much to add. I mean, I just want to say, like, a lot of these issues that we're discussing today are really near and dear to my heart. You know, I've worked, my career's been, I've worked in a lot of different places. I've worked in DC twice, including on the Hill for Senator Lieberman back in the day, as well as at the Federal Communications Commission. But, you know, some of the issues that we'll be tackling today are ones that, you know, are challenges I've seen in every domain that I've worked in. And so I'm glad we're having this opportunity to chat about some of what these challenges are and what we can do about them. Janie, back to you.
Great, thank you, Yul, Hiro, and Kwan. And I'm Janie Lau, the moderator for this panel. Most recently, I was the General Counsel of InterDigital, which is a publicly traded technology company that focuses on video and wireless technologies. And currently, as Madeline mentioned, I serve as Vice Chair of the Asian American Council on the Comcast NBC Universal Diversity Council. And I also serve on the board of directors of Arduro, which is a sustainable rubber company. So before we get started, I just wanted to make the point that each of us here on the panel today are here in our personal capacity. So any opinions that we offer are our own opinions and not necessarily those of our employers or any of our affiliated organizations. So with that, let's get started. Representative Khanna had such a fabulous introduction to our panel. He actually referenced a former title that we had for our panel, which was, you know, the tech industry leaky pipeline. and I just love the imagery, you know, evoked by that, because as Representative Khanna noted, you know, one could argue, and we can take issue with this later on in the panel, but, you know, one could argue that you know, that AAPI representation at certain stages of the pipeline, you know, is actually rather robust, perhaps at the early and middle stages of the pipeline. But I think we can all agree that it drops off precipitously at the management and certainly at the executive leadership levels. And I think, you know, we probably have heard this referred to as being the bamboo ceiling after the glass ceiling that women face in the corporate world. So I guess, you know, my first question for our panelists, and, you know, maybe we'll start with you, Yul, is, you know, why does the bamboo ceiling exist, and not just exist, but persist, despite, you know, Asian Americans making advances in other areas of society?
Sure. So, you know, it's pretty well documented, and the statistics bear this out, that in many industries, including in tech as well as other places like law, there's a strong representation of APIs within the different organizations we work in. But as you get kind of higher in the organization to more senior levels, there's a pretty steep drop off. And again, it's been pretty well documented in tech in Silicon Valley. I think the numbers are something like, roughly 47% of professional workers are API, but at the executive ranks, it drops down to roughly half of that. In law, Justice Goodwin Liu on the Supreme Court did a study a few years ago indicating that APIs are the largest minority group working in the legal industry, but they have the lowest ratio of partners to associates. And so there's a lot of questions as to like why this is the case. I've read a lot of research, and I think you can kind of point to at least 3 different sources of why this phenomenon exists. One is embedded stereotypes about APIs. This model minority myth that Asian Americans tend to be smart, hardworking, but they often lack the communication skills to become leaders. And so they're often passed over for these opportunities, or certainly not groomed and mentored. The other issue is around mentorship. A lot of times your ability to really get ahead in your career depends on having the right internal champions, mentors who can guide you through the career. And in many cases, APIs don't find those mentors within their organizations or outside. Part of the problem is that we don't have enough people in these leadership roles to begin with to serve as mentors. But in general, there has been a lack of these networks that allow APIs to find mentors, and for people who are in these roles to find other mentees to support them in their careers. And I think the other source that's been kind of talked about at times are just innate cultural differences. In my case, I'll just talk to my own personal experience. I was born in this country. My parents immigrated from South Korea, but I was born in New York and I was raised here. But I was raised in a very traditional Korean household, and I was always taught, to behave a certain way in front of my social superiors, whether it's speaking a very low kind of tone of voice, kind of taking a very submissive posture, not challenging authority. And as much as I hate to say that this is true, I've noticed that in my own tendencies, especially under conditions of stress, I'll often resort to these behaviors I've learned ever since I was a child. So one of the things I've had to do is try to recognize when my kind of behaviors, the way I present to other people, may not be aligned with what they expect, and especially among people who don't have kind of a broad, deeper appreciation of my cultural background. So yeah, I think there are these like kind of structural as well as internal sources of why this phenomenon exists, and I think there's a lot that we can do to try to overcome it.
Yeah, and Kwan, in your role as the CEO of the Society of Asian Scientists and Engineers, do you hear this feedback from your membership in terms of, their concerns about their ability to kind of ascend the corporate ladder and break into the leadership ranks?
Definitely. The stats that Yul mentioned is very pervasive in the STEM industry, where we are, quote unquote, overrepresented relative to our population numbers. But I think once you get into the company, you look at the talent within the company, and Asians fall out more than any other group based on a few studies that we've looked at. One particular study that we surveyed our executives from the Fortune 500 sees that Asians are 3 times less likely to go into management. And so folks are starting to realize that, and they're asking, what can they do? I think Yul mentioned about mentorship. I think that's important to do. And one thing we always try to emphasize, and we're trying to train our folks, is they have to have cultural agility. We know that the United States is based on Western European culture, particularly British culture, and where debate, disagreement is seen as a positive sign, right? Public speaking, eye contact, which in the Asian value, the Asian behavior, we show respect by not looking. A lot of the Eastern Asians show value of respect by not looking in someone's eyes, especially somebody of a higher authority. To show respect, you don't talk back to them, you don't disagree with them. So having those type of skill sets in which we try to train and build awareness around, that they're operating in a very Western civilization, and the culture of these companies come from that Western civilization. And as Asian Americans, and whether you're a first generation like myself or a third generation, our culture permeates how we act, especially when we're raised at home. So we always teach our folks to say that, be aware of how you communicate. As Yul said, that what your expectations and how you want to communicate, make sure it's received on the other end. For personal experience, my first manager at work as an engineer very good German name, Mueller, right? He took me aside one day and he says, Khan, why don't you look people when you're talking to them? And I was thinking, why would I need to look at someone? Because my ear is pointed at you. That's all I need to do to listen, right? And he goes, no, you have to look at me to show me that you're listening. And I said, no one's ever told me that, because my dad told me that if I looked at him, I'm disrespecting him. And so that was, an aha moment. And the other thing he mentioned to me, he said, you need to speak up during our meetings. And I said, well, I'm trying to be respectful and wait till everybody's finished. But as we all know, in corporate meetings, if you wait till everybody has their say, you're not going to be able to squeeze in. So I personally have to unwind that tape that I've learned when I was young and be very conscious of eye contact, of these. So these skill sets and these behaviors, I mean, being respectable is very admirable. How you behave and how you communicate that is different in a different culture. And I think that's something that as Asian Americans, we have to be aware of that. And the flip side is, I think there's a lot in the corporate community and the American community as a whole can learn from Asian leadership. Sometimes being a little bit more patient, waiting to hear everybody's thoughts, is actually a good thing, and not trying to talk over them. So I think there is a balance between us being more culturally agile, and for companies, corporations, and the whole culture can benefit from learning about Asian leadership.
Those are great points, Khan. Thank you. And Hiro, I'd love for you to jump in here. Just when you referenced your personal background and your biography, and now you're, a general counsel of a tech company. So you've ascended to the top of the corporate ladder. But I'd love to hear your own challenges as you were making your way to the top.
Yeah, thank you, Johnny. I read the story of Yul and Kwan resonate with me, and I think that as a first immigrant, is the issue of behave in a certain way at home, and then go in the real world. Then your expectation is very different, and so it's just shifting the perspective and thinking about different ways of behaving at home versus in the real business world, I think is a challenge. And I remember when I started a law firm that, respect for the partners, respect for the higher authority. And I vividly remember walking to the partner's office and wait outside of the office, and just, be very reluctant to go into the office. And they were asking me, why are you standing at the outside of the office? Just barge right in. And so that's kind of just one anecdote story that I remember about my my youthful days, and I think that also the difference between aggressive and assertive is something that I learned. Just to be aggressive, advocating your point of view, the difference between aggressive and assertive is something that I learned over the years, that is there is different attitude, and assertive is what I think is important in the Western culture. You can be respectful, but be assertive your own point of view is something that I've learned over the years.
I completely agree. And, I just wanted to also address, for Asian American women, we face all of these same challenges and maybe an additional challenge, right? So, Sheryl Sandberg had talked about women in the corporate world, being stuck in this double bind, right? Where we're expected to exhibit all of the traits of leadership, but when it's exhibited by women, it actually makes us less likable. And I think for Asian American women, there's this additional perception of us as being demure and passive. And those aren't necessarily prized traits in leaders in the corporate sector. And I remember when I was first promoted to general counsel of my company, and I had a director come to me, and he was actually one of the directors who supported my promotion, supported my CEO picking me. But he also felt the need to address with me, he wanted to make sure I was going to be the only woman on the executive team. And he just wanted to make sure that I would have the courage to stand up to the other executives and that my voice wouldn't be drowned out. And he just wanted to confirm with me that I had it in me to do that I was tough enough. And it just reminded me that, a lot of times the insidiousness of the model minority myth is that it often comes from people who are quote unquote well-intentioned, right? So they think they're paying you a compliment, or they think they're actually helping you. But it can be that much more difficult to call out, right? And that much more difficult to explain to people why, they aren't necessarily helping by perpetuating these myths. So, for me, a lot of times when we try to address these challenges, and I think all of you have done a great job of pointing out kind of the structural challenges, but then also the unconscious biases that, our colleagues might bring to the table. But then you've also given us, a lot of helpful tips as to how our own self-awareness of other people's, preconceptions or misconceptions, but then also maybe some of our own ingrained behaviors, right, might be contributing to all of this. And there's something I think for all of us to work on. Something else that I wanted to bring up was how a lot of these stereotypes are reinforced in the media. And I know Yul, you've had such a diverse and interesting career. And I know, you actually had a stint on a fairly famous reality show. And, I read once that, you had a very specific reason as to why you were driven to be on that show. Do you want to talk about that?
Sure. So I assume you're referring to the fact that I went on Survivor. Yeah, so I went on Survivor back in, 2006 on the 13th season of the show. It was a very controversial season. I think for the first time in the show's history, and maybe in television history, they divided the contestants based on race. So they actually set up the tribes so that there was a white tribe, a black tribe, Latino tribe, and an Asian tribe to have this war of the racist dynamic. It was a crazy idea. But they couldn't get enough people to apply to be on the show from the Asian American community. Because I guess back then you didn't get a lot of folks from our community applying to be on reality shows. So they ended up recruiting everyone, including me. And when I got the opportunity out of the blue, I honestly was just like, this sounds crazy. Why would I ever do this? It just seemed so off the beaten track. And I thought my parents would probably disown me if I tried to go on. But I thought about it and I just realized, growing up, I didn't have a lot of role models, and when I watched a ton of television and I rarely saw people from our community on television or in films. And to the extent that they did appear, they're typically portrayed according to these very one-dimensional stereotypes. For Asian men, they're usually portrayed as being kind of nerds who lack social skills, or kung fu masters who, could kick butt, but they couldn't speak English. For Asian women, they're often kind of exoticized. They were like, these geishas or dragon ladies. And I just, I didn't realize the impact it had on me. But over time, I think the impact was pretty profound and pervasive. It really limited how I saw myself, and it defined how I viewed my relationships with other people. And I never thought of myself as someone who could be a leader, as someone who could speak out. And so it took me a very long time to build more confidence in myself. Like I had a very long journey where I just had tremendous amount of self-doubt, low esteem, had some pretty severe social anxiety issues when I was younger. And it just occurred to me, like, if I was growing up and I saw someone who looked like me, someone I could identify with on television, where they were just like a normal person, would it have helped me? And I think it would have. I think it would have. I was so starved for people I could identify with and for role models. And so it occurred to me, like, listen, like, even though it's clear why they're casting me, and it was also clear that I was being cast as like that stereotype. Like I was clearly the Asian nerd, right? So, but I realized the great thing about reality shows is that it's not scripted. So it didn't matter why I got put on the show. Like the problem for our community isn't that there's a lack of API talent in terms of actors. There are plenty of them. It's just that they don't get to write their own script in most cases, right? They have to read a script that someone else has written for them, depending on how they think an API should act. So the great thing about a reality show is, like, once I'm on, I could be myself. And so that's why I went on the show.
That's great. And just by being yourself, you were groundbreaking, right? Because you wouldn't follow the script that the producers wanted to give you. Khan, what do you think about the role of representation in media and culture generally? And how can those contribute to or help kind of knock down some of these challenges that we face in the corporate sector?
There's a saying that if you can't see it, you can't be it, right? And I think that's true for young aspiring folks, is when you look at your role models and look at who you look up to, you need to have people of different backgrounds, of different types, so that you can imagine yourself and making sure that you can see yourself in those roles. And particularly when there's a dearth of leadership in STEM, even though we're, quote, overrepresented in the entry level, I think it's important. And particularly media has an extra influence because we all consume it. And I think that that's important for media representation. I mean, Crazy Rich Asians, was a groundbreaking watershed moment, just like Joy Luck Club. But I think this moment is different from Joy Luck because it spurred on what Yul said, is that there are other creatives behind the camera writing the scripts, directors. The recent Nomad win was amazing. So I think all this publicity and influence will help inspire the next generation and put folks in front, behind, and writing the stories that we need to hear and see so that we can see ourselves represented in the public. And I would say for STEM, I think that's true too. Representative Khan said that, there's only a couple of Asian leaders that are very prevalent out there. I think we need more like them and more diverse, more women leaders. Something you touched upon is the dearth of women leaders and the challenges in the double, glass bamboo ceiling. Of all the groups that we see, Asian women in STEM are least likely to be promoted out of any group, male, female, ethnicity. It is because of those stereotypes. And so I think the richness of the portrayals in the media will give people different options to think about, how do we view women? How do we view technical women? How do we view women in leadership position? And I think that's something that we as an organization is trying to tackle, by hosting conferences and things like that. But I think society as a whole, I think we're on this watershed moment that we can do something great if we take this energy around, Asian American awareness. I have friends who called me and asked me how he's doing because of the COVID, because of the Atlanta killings. I think this is our time. I really do. And I think that this is something that we need to leverage and continue and not let it die like, after the Joy Luck Club. Honestly, there was such a death of media in between Joy Luck Club and Crazy Rich Asians.
Maybe
completely. And I'm yes.
Oh, yeah. A lot of what Khan said really resonates. And so I should touch on a lot of interesting points. But one thing is, I've been so kind of gratified to see in the last 5 to 10 years, there's been this proliferation of APIs in media, in government, in tech, in general. And I actually think that tech played a pretty helpful role in kind of breaking through the logjam. What I think happened, this is just my theory, I haven't seen statistics bearing out, but I think it, at least in broad strokes, generally true. It used to be the case that for someone to appear in media, there were a number of kind of gatekeepers you had to go through. You had to go through the television networks or the movie studios. You had to get an agent. And these, for the most part, were not very open to people from our community or people of color in general. I think what technology allowed to be the case is that it made the cost of distribution and content creation, content distribution much, much lower. So, for example, if you look at YouTube, the early YouTube stars were disproportionately API. And I don't think that's coincidence. So what ended up happening was these people would never have gotten a chance to appear on screen in the old traditional world. But because of technology and these distribution platforms, they were able to create content featuring themselves and then find an audience, find a niche. And over time, I think it helped to do a couple of things. One, validate that you can have a successful viewership and garner a significant audience, even though you have an API as kind of the main lead. And secondly, I think it helps it sort of normalize to most people that watching APIs on some sort of screen isn't that weird. And so I think over time, it kind of helped allow people within our community who otherwise wouldn't have had the voice or the visibility to build their own, hone their skills, build their kind of base, and then find that kind of distribution channel in the audience. And that now we're seeing this kind of have this flywheel effect where now it's not uncommon to have people on screen, behind the screen. Like Minari was another great example. There have been so many positive examples. And to Khan's point, when I look around at what's been happening with the kind of anti-Asian hate, it's been awful. It's very personal for me. My mom was accosted by a man. My mom's 76 years old. She was on her way to go to Kaiser to get her vaccine shot, and a man confronted her and wouldn't let her get out of her parking spot. And when she asked him to move, he basically said, "You can't tell me what to do. This is my country." And then it was clear he was looking for a confrontation. So she got scared, went inside her car and just waited until he left. Stuff like that is just heartbreaking, right? I mean, we've heard so many stories of this happening to either people we know or to ourselves in some cases. The silver lining that I see though is I've seen this catalyst, this like widespread movement within our community that I haven't seen before. You've seen flecks of it before. Just Kwan, you mentioned kind of Joy Luck Club and Better Luck Tomorrow kind of. But the scale at which I've seen people mobilize and get involved in both the political process and mobilizing within community efforts is just unprecedented. I mean, there was this letter that had gone around that was signed by like thousands of Asian American business leaders. I haven't seen things like that. And I'm pretty optimistic that this is not just going to be a flash in the pan. And it's also, I think, triggered a lot of really productive conversations around other things like the bamboo ceiling, around other types of challenges that our community has faced for decades, or if not longer, but hasn't gotten broader visibility. And so I really feel like this is our time. And I'm pretty optimistic that this is not going to be just one moment in time, but it's going to lead to sustainable changes like in our families and our organizations in our country and in all of our communities. So I'm really optimistic for that.
And I'm so happy that you and Kwan brought up, the current crisis of anti-Asian hate and violence that's sweeping our country. And, I think it brings to the fore again, yet another stereotype, right, of the perpetual foreigner and how Asians are never regarded as ever being truly American. And Hiro, I don't know if you want to share a little bit about your own personal story. I mean, you and me both, we're both immigrants, right? But there are plenty of AAPIs who were born in this country, and yet neither group is ever able to shed this perception that we're not from here, that we're always from somewhere else, which makes it all the more easy to vilify us, right? And to attach, things like the COVID-19 virus to us as being our fault. So do you want to share your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So that goes back to sort of why the Asians are not in the leadership or management roles, and their ability to use communication skills is not as robust as it should be. And I think just bringing my own personal story is that when I came to the United States, I wasn't able to speak English as well. I grew up speaking Japanese. So STEM, science and math, when I was in high school in Japan, it was more advanced in terms of acquisition of knowledge. So when I first came here as a high school student, I had pretty science and math field was relatively easy. And so throughout my high school and college education, I kind of stayed away from humanity courses just because the language proficiency in English wasn't great. So I think that's part of as an immigrant, my own immigrant story, that it's not that I didn't want to study humanities or pursue more education and writing, but it wasn't I wasn't very good at it. And so that's just my own personal story, but maybe that may be true for other people as well, that born outside of the United States would come here, but English may not be as proficient as peers, and therefore not only the stereotypical image portrayed in the media, but also our own self-image or self-confidence about ability to speak, ability to communicate, persuade, be aggressive. It may not be as strong as it could be. So that's my own kind of reflection on my own personal story.
Yeah, and the challenges of how can people expect us to be leaders if they don't even view us as one of them, right? Mm-hmm. If you're viewed as someone other or from the outside. So at this moment, I just would like to remind the audience that we will be taking questions at the end of this session. So if you do have any questions that you would like to submit to our panel, feel free to submit it through the platform. I'd like to pivot a little bit. I think someone had mentioned earlier on in our discussion the fact that the AAPI community is not a monolith, right? And that, quite frankly, the model minority myth, comes nowhere near to describing the circumstances of certain segments of our community. And, I'm thinking of Pacific Islanders in particular, and also Southeast Asians. And Khan, I know your background being Vietnamese American. I know this is near and dear to your heart, but for example, what is your organization doing in order to help level the playing field for all segments of our incredibly diverse community?
Jenny, thanks for asking that question, because there is a belief out there, even within the Asian community, that we are a monolith, or at least we're doing well, too well to need any help. And that really is a disservice to those of us who aren't doing well. In particular, I think many of you have seen some of the reports out in New York, where some of the poorest communities in New York City are Asian American communities, right? And if we think that Asian American communities are doing too well, those needs and the support for those folks aren't being addressed. And so I think for an organization like ours, like SASE, what we do is we show them role models. I have a student who's Cambodian. He leads our organization. He's the first in anywhere near his family to be the first one to graduate from college or attend college. And they need to have those role models, right? Opportunities, especially in STEM, and opportunities to see pathways that they don't see on their own. It's not a blue collar. As we know, technology is going to be the driver of the economy for the next 100 years. And if we don't open those opportunities to folks who don't traditionally have them, our Pacific Islanders, Southeast Asians, especially from the history of immigration where they came from war, right? Came from a disadvantaged background, that they don't have those role models set. I mean, a lot of the Chinese immigrants during the Cold War were recruited for their scientific and technological backgrounds. The recent tech industry relied on a lot of the South Asians who had technical backgrounds. So those communities tend to do better because of their immigration policy and status, where some, like myself, fled war. I mean, we literally dropped everything and jumped on a boat. And I mean, surviving at sea and being picked up with, I could be speaking French right now if the French picked me up instead of English. So, I mean, I think we have to be cognizant of the different rich stories that we bring to America. And I think that that's something that we haven't told a really good story about. When you say Vietnamese, most people think about the Vietnamese War. They don't know that it's one of the largest growing economies in the world, even through COVID, right? And so there's a rich story among the Asian diaspora that we need to convey and tell better. And this goes back to the whole media, right? Is that we can put that out there for consumption. And I love what Yul said about, technology being a catalyst, breaking down some of those barriers. Though I would say that technology also brings out sometimes the worst in people as a catalyst for that too. So I think that has to be moderated. But for the Asian American storytelling, Wong Fu, you can name, Jubilee Project, all these people that we know are a little bit more household names because of the technology. So definitely.
Yeah, Khan, you raise a great point. Asian Americans, do have the widest wealth gap amongst the major racial and ethnic groups. And, you even referenced, Crazy Rich Asians, which I love that movie, but that, that also perpetuates or, keeps the spotlight on the wealthiest Asians, right? And really probably does a disservice to all of the Asian Americans out there who are still struggling, who did not necessarily come or arrive in this country with certain privileges that other segments of our community did. And you referenced, whether they were refugees or coming from, escaping war or poverty. So I think it's just an incredible point that, we should always be mindful, while there is power in us all banding together, right? So, because our numbers, relatively speaking, I think we're still sitting around 6% of the US population. We're not quite as big or as strong politically as other groups. And that's why it is important for us to all band together, for us to not lose sight of the fact that even though we're all working towards similar goals, we're not necessarily all starting from the same vantage point. So I think that's a great point. Yul, yes, Hiro.
Jenny, I wanted to add one additional point that as a Japanese American, I think that I agree with you, Khan, that each immigrant has a different kind of a historical background and time when they immigrated. And as Japanese Americans, when I was in as a student, a lot of the first question that people ask is, what generation are you? Issei, Sansei, Yonsei, fourth generation, etc. So Japanese American have immigrated for a long time ago and has grown, to generations. And whereas maybe other Asian immigrants are not as long, and came here for different reasons. And also the Asians, yes, Asians, but Japanese culture, Korean culture, Chinese culture, Vietnamese culture, there is definitely commonalities, but it has a very different, distinct, rich cultural, heritage each nation has. And so, why I agree that the Asian, as a group, as a people of color, should be as band together, so to speak, to combat unconscious bias. But I think also, I like to sort of view as ourselves as a united nation of a different cultural heritage, and to celebrate the differences in our own communities. So that's what I wanted to share.
Completely agree. And also, I'm Chinese American, but actually, I often refer to myself as being Taiwanese American or Hong Kong, or I'm half and half, because there's a big distinction to me. My family fled, the communist takeover of mainland China, and that's a very distinctive and strong part of our identity. But for after I immigrated here to the United States, that distinction was lost on a lot of people. And to a lot of Americans, we are a monolith, not just Chinese Americans as a whole, but, even this violence against our community, a lot of, the incidents, the victims are not even Chinese American or of Chinese heritage, right? So for the perpetrators, they don't care that, you're actually Korean American or Vietnamese American. To them, all they were thinking about was COVID, and that, you look like you're from China. And so there's this irony, right, where, I think we're self-aware of all of our diversity within our community, but then we're all often treated like we're the same. And so a lot of the solutions that we have to find, we have to kind of acknowledge that challenge, right, and face it head on. Even while we insist, right, we should be respected for our diversity, and kind of honor all of that. So, we've spent a lot of time, talking about structural challenges in representation. I'd love to focus more of our conversation to kind of strategies that we can deploy. What can we do about this, right? So what can we do to break down these structural barriers and challenges, and I know we've already talked a little bit about that, but I'd love for the audience to come away with more, I guess, a little bit more hope and optimism that these challenges can be overcome, and what can we personally do, but then what can we also do as a community, right, to try to find a way through this, right, bust through that bamboo ceiling. And really, get all of the AEI community well represented within the STEAM pipeline. So, Khan, I don't know, can we start with you in terms of, what are you most hopeful about, and, what strategies or, policy changes, would you like to see most to help us try to solve this problem?
Thanks, Janie. I think, based on what Yul said earlier about, there's this moment in time, I'm actually very hopeful about what I'm seeing before me. As Yul pointed out, some of these things in the past, we've seen sparks of it, but it never took hold. And the Asian community has really galvanized, I think, recently here through, whether it's the Taft Foundation that's just started or other initiative. One of the things that I found out in my work at SASE is that even the most successful executives, Asian executives, do not network well relative to the women's group, the African Americans group. So I would challenge all our listeners and those who are listening to this is that reach out and expand your network. Know who are the other Asian leaders, connect with them. That's one of the things we started was an executive forum for Asian leaders. They were well connected within their company, but across companies, other executives, I think we're really good at running in our own lane, however we define that lane is. We're very good at focusing on it. But across lanes, I think that's something as Asian Americans, we need to look across and collaborate a lot more. I think we're really good within our own community. The Vietnamese community here in Denver, I know pretty well. But beyond that, I think we need to collaborate and work across whether ethnicity or even outside of our Asian community, with our African Americans. We're partner up with the Society of Women Engineers, the Society of Hispanic Professional Engineers. We should see each other as support and ally. To your point, we're only 6%. There's so much 6% weight you can throw around, right? And you need to add on weight by being good allies. And that means that sometimes we have these difficult conversations about, the history of America. A lot of recent immigrants may not know the history of African America. They've heard about slavery. They may not know about redlining or Jim Crow laws. So I think it's imperative for us to both ask and help each other in this movement. And the last thing I'll leave with is I'm hopeful because of the younger generation. They, to me, are very open. They are very verbal. They communicate, and they are looking for opportunities to change the world. Sometimes they need to understand that there are some boundaries and realities, but I don't want to hamper on their hopes and dreams, right? Because they are a very hopeful group. So sometimes I just say some of us older folks, and I'm one of them, to step out of the way sometimes, right? We're there to guide and mentor them, but we need to step out of the way for them to lead sometimes. So that's where my hope comes from.
That's great, Khan. And Yul, you've had senior roles at some of the biggest technology companies, but you've also worked in DC, as you mentioned. So what have you seen, that works, and what would you advocate that we do more of?
Yeah, I have lots of thoughts here. So I'll just go through them quickly. One is just getting better visibility to numbers. It's hard for us to advocate for meaningful change until we actually know what the numbers are. The fact that APIs are often kind of grouped together as this monolithic thing masks the fact that different subpopulations are having different challenges and are not equally successful. So, this is, I think, kind of a basic thing. Like, you need to start from data, and just getting better data, I think, is going to be critically important. I think another thing we can do is try to expand, make sure that conversations about DEI diversity within our organizations also include APIs. Like, it generally has been the case that in many organizations, because of the model minority myth and the fact that Asian Americans are often over-indexed in general relative to their overall population, they are not considered to be an underrepresented minority. And so they're not even part of the discussion. So I think one of the things that we can try to do within our own organizations is to educate, look, there's clearly not a pipeline issue for many of us, although in certain subsegments there are. Like, we need to get more people from certain communities like Pacific Islanders and Southeast Asians. But there's an overwhelming evidence of once you're in the door, people from our community don't get promoted, don't get the same sort of leadership opportunities. And so making sure that the broader conversations around DEI incorporate APIs. I think another one is just we need to get more vocal. We need to speak up internally, externally. I had this one experience in one company I worked at where my boss had 12 direct reports and decided he had too many direct reports, was spending too much time in one-on-ones. So he decided to layer some of his direct reports. The people who got layered, including myself, were the only Asian Americans on this person's staff. So out of 12 people, the only Asian Americans got layered. Statistically, that is like really, really unlikely, right? And it occurred to me, gosh, if there had been 3 Black Americans, if there had been 3 Latinos, if there had been 3 women even, if there, any one of these, someone at some point would have been like, wait a second, this doesn't look quite right. It would have raised some red flags. But because it happened to Asian APIs, no one batted an eye. Like neither him nor his kind of like our HR partners kind of, signaled that, hey, maybe we should take a deeper look here to figure out what's going on. I regret that I didn't speak up. I should have at that point. And so I think we also have to get into, leaning into areas that make us uncomfortable and actually speaking out when we feel like there's something that needs another look. And I think we have to do this both internally within our organizations and externally. We have to become more vocal outside and try to bring that type of pressure when it's called for. We talked about the issue of self-awareness, being cognizant of your own behaviors and recognizing when there's a disparity between how you perceive yourself versus how other people might be interpreting your behaviors. I think that's always something, I've learned to do more of. And I think all of us have had to learn to understand when our kind of innate behaviors may not be received and interpreted by other people in the way that they're intended. I think learning about unconscious bias, incorporating them into diversity and conscious bias training, again, generally find that APIs tend to be absent from any of these types of trainings, right? Like it's not usually something that's brought up in the context of like model minority myth or perpetual foreigner syndrome. So advocating for that. To Khan's point, building networks internally and externally, like either building personal networks or, through professional organizations like SASE, like we have to network to be able to help each other and share data points and to provide mentorship. And focusing on mentorship, I think that's a critical ingredient. Like we all have to be willing to be mentors for other people who are coming up the pipeline, as well as actively seek out mentors. One of the challenges I found is that a lot of APIs don't reach out to people for mentorship. They're just kind of hesitant to do so. I've generally found that like a lot of people, even if they're not API leaders, are willing to be mentors if you just ask. A lot of them will say no, they're just too busy. But if you don't ask, you'll never find those mentors. Sorry, a couple more points. Education, I think we've talked about this as well, making sure that our education curriculum talks about APIs and the history of APIs like in this country. That's another critical element. We need to get more active politically by either like running for office or supporting candidates who are running for office. I mean, this is absolutely critical. I mean, this is why like organizations like APACS is so important. But the more we're represented in these kind of corridors of power and can pass legislation and policies that make sure that our community is well represented, the more it'll help all of us. Donating, like that's another thing. Like APIs like don't necessarily always have a history of making donations. I think that all of us should consider donating to organizations that are representing our community, donating to political candidates. The Asian American Foundation really was formed to address this fundamental gap, which was there was always this constant scramble for trying to get funds. And it was kind of a stumbling block for a lot of API organizations. And hopefully like with this massive organization that's going to be committing something like $250 million, like that's going to be able to provide the funding to allow these organizations to actually do the hard work of getting things done as opposed to constantly trying to raise money. And the last thing I just maybe mentioned, I mentioned this before, is I do think that we need to organize externally and bring external pressure. Like organizations, communities, politicians are sensitive to external pressure. There have been a lot of new organizations that have been forming, and I think because of the anti-Asian hate, there's been a lot more kind of activity and organization happening. So I'm optimistic, and I've already seen some of this starting to have real impact. But these are all things that we could be doing. You don't have to do all of these things, but doing any one of these things, I think will help move the needle.
Completely agree. And I do think we are at this moment where I do see the opportunity for us to do a lot of what you just said, because I do think, the community is galvanized, and not just our own community, but our allies and people's consciousnesses are being blown wide open. So Hiro, you actually made this great point. Originally, our panel was going to be called Building the STEM Pipeline, but you were insistent that we add the A for arts to make it the STEAM pipeline. Do you want to elaborate on why you feel so strongly about that?
Yeah, so that kind of tied to the Asians' emphasis on STEM, and why is it that we are not represented in the leadership or management role. I think that's what's missing from that is the A, which is arts. Now, arts encompassing not only the visual arts, but also humanity studies. And, that ties to the analytical thinking, critical writing, so that aspect of it is, I think it's I would say not missing, but it's not emphasized, I think, in the STEM education. It's all STEM has a connotation of emphasis on technical competence, learning about coding, learning about math, science, but it's the missing part is that the human spirit, learning about philosophy, learning about ethics, morality, which I think is a critical element to be a leader, to be more attuned to the human needs. And I think that's one of the reasons why I think I strongly we should advocate not STEM but STEAM, and that is really primary reason why I think we should focus on STEAM. And I love Yul and Khan's list of things that we should be doing. I think I agree all of the list things that you guys suggested. On my own reflection, I think self-awareness is for me is key. Self-awareness that my behavior at home, while I was growing, living with my parents and working at the workplace, is different. And I have to behave differently. I can't sit outside of the partner's office and wait to be called in. You just to be more assertive, not aggressive. Those kind of things that I think, maybe there's a training, but also just be self-awareness, cognitive awareness. I think that's, for me, it's one of the key things that has helped me. And just going back to this unconscious bias, and I think the media portrayal of Asian Americans kind of feeds into the stereotypical image, which then feeds the unconscious bias, because the rest of the population sees what they see is what's portrayed in the media as Asian as a particular type of behavior. Then that reinforces the unconscious bias, and so that's pretty hard to break down. But I think the emphasis, all the things that Khan and Yul talked about as to how to break down this media portrayal of Asians in the media, democratization of the entertainment business is helping to possibly change the unconscious bias input. So those are my feedback.
I love that. A for arts, A for awareness. And I would also submit A for athletics. That's something near and dear to my heart, especially for women. I saw some statistic where they found that like 70% or some insane number like that of Fortune 500 women executives had participated in organized sports at the collegiate level. I think especially for women, but I would posit for Asian Americans generally, involvement in organized sports is, just a really great way to start at an early age. It's like a low risk, low stakes arena in which you can practice all of these soft skills, right? That the corporate sector prizes so much in their leaders, right? Your leadership attributes, working together as a team, right? Sacrificing one's own personal statistics, right? To get that win as a team. And for me, that's an area of emphasis. I remember when I was young growing up and, I played team sports, and I remember not my own parents, but their Asian friends, there was a lot of hand wringing. It's like, how can you let your daughter spend any time, aside from school? Like they really thought like all of my time should be devoted to academics, and they really saw athletics and sports in opposition to that. But given, kind of the American obsession with sports and how, I've found a lot of the lingo and networking in the corporate sector revolves around sports, right? Revolves around not just knowing the scores from the previous night's games, right? Or what's going on in the sports world, but just general corporate lingo and idioms, right? They're almost always like they depend on your personal knowledge of football, right? It's like, okay, let's move the ball down the field. Let's get the first down, and if you're not familiar with that, it can really put you at a disadvantage. And for me, kind of this has sometimes been a blind spot for us, right? Like where we don't necessarily appreciate the value of athletics and and how you can really practice and gain a lot of these soft skills, these executive leadership skills, in an arena that most people would not associate with the corporate sector, and not even necessarily with STEAM or STEM. At this point, we're going to take questions from the audience, and we actually already have one submitted. So what were some of the barriers you all faced in your career pathways as Asian Americans? So do I have a volunteer to tackle that first?
Sure, I'll go first. It's funny that you mentioned, Janie, sports, because I noticed when I first joined the corporate ladder that a lot of people play golf, right? It was just, that's where business was getting done. And I've never played golf. Now, I played these single sport, other things like tennis, right? Which, going back, reflecting what you said, is organized sports, team sports versus individual sports, right? So no to the golf, no to the tennis, yes to the basketball and baseball. But I mean, sarcastically speaking, I think we have to recognize and train our folks to be aware, what Hiro said, and you all, is that self-awareness, that there are cultures that we step into when we join a company or an organization. And the better tuned we are at what those kind of unsaid written rules, the way they communicate, the way they have relationships, especially in the leadership, the sooner we recognize it, the sooner we're aware of that, I think the more progress we'll make in penetrating those leadership circles. So I think for me is I didn't understand that that's where golf, particularly the company I was working, is where they made those deals. And the people who golfed well and who went on these golfing trips got the promotion. So I wasn't aware. So I would say to anybody who's listening, as you join an organization, be very, very cognizant of what those cultures are, how they speak, where are the deals being made? Is it the afternoon lunch walk that people do and they disappear and you're at your desk eating your lunch and trying to crank out work? Is it the after hours time where people are, throwing back drinks and watching TV, but talking about and making an impression to their boss who they are in their leadership skills? So I think those were my challenges because I was focused, on getting the job done, doing it well, doing it under budget, in advance of time, but I didn't understand all this other stuff, dynamics that were going on. So those were some of my challenges.
Great, thank you. Yul?
I would love to hear you answer this question, because I mean, one of the things that some of the studies found, including the one from Ascend that was done by Denise Peck and Bakji, for API women, they have the double whammy of both the kind of ethnic challenges as well as the gender challenges. So yeah, I'd love to just kind of hear, your kind of the challenges that you faced. And I'd be curious to see if you felt like there was what was the intersection of these two things? Like, did they compound some of the challenges you faced? Were they distinct? Was one more kind of prevalent and challenging in your career than the other?
I think there are too many to bring up here. Some of the ones that I can think of right off the bat, I remember having a conversation with a fellow executive, and we were talking about our company's challenges in China, in the Chinese market, and the challenges of negotiating with Chinese licensees. And this was a very difficult problem. We were all kind of at our wits end. And I remember him saying to me, Jamie, let me tell you how Chinese people think. and I was, just a little taken aback, and he just plowed right ahead. And then I had to listen to him tell me for 10 minutes how Chinese people think. And again, it was well-meaning. He was trying to solve a problem. We were both trying to solve a problem. And I remember relaying this exchange to my CEO later on. And that was when I actually introduced the term mansplaining to my CEO, which he got a kick out of. And the same executive, and it occurred to me that the same executive had made another remark. And this was right after Trump had made the comment about certain people being from SHIT whole nations. And, and this executive had made light of that comment. in remarks to the entire company. And a lot of employees were understandably very upset. A lot of our employees were immigrants themselves from said countries. And in an attempt to smooth things over, this executive then said, well, I think we can all agree that at this company, we don't care where you're from as long as you're good at math. and I just had to, and I had to tell my CEO, this is not appropriate. We just compounded the problem. We just created a new problem. And, quite frankly, my CEO, my CEO at the time, who's white, he was very honest with me. He was like, Janie, you're going to have to explain to me what the issue is, and he has an Asian son, a Cambodian adoptee. He's like, I don't see a problem with that comment. And I had to explain, look, we are reinforcing that we value our engineers, only for their mathematical prowess, right? So if they have aspirations to move up in the company, right, they're going to see that, well, I'm not seen as having those leadership skills, right? Those soft skills. I'm just a math genius. I'm here just to crunch the numbers, and that's all I can expect. And so, but trust me, I was shaking, just having to relay this to my CEO. I didn't know if he was going to buy it or not. But, I think that goes to the importance of speaking up. So, I was general counsel at the time, even though I was so fearful, I felt like I had enough political capital to make that point, right? And also to call out, my fellow executives for things like that. But I understand that not all of us feel that comfortable, right? Feel like they're in a position to do so. And that's why, as bystanders, I think for those of us who can, we should step in and call this out. And, for me, I also learned, because this happens so frequently, that I had to learn to choose, pick my battles, right? That it wasn't necessarily smart to make an issue, at least publicly, right? On the spot, out of every single microaggression, every single incident that rubbed me the wrong way, right? You really have to choose your moments to do that. Not to say that you should just let things slide, because you can always bring it up later at a more appropriate time, right? But for me, it was just registering it, but knowing when to, strategically, right, not bring it up right away, or bring it up later. Another comment that I was subjected to was, I was working with an investment banker, and I was negotiating a contract. And this is earlier on in my career. And he was frustrated with the pace of negotiations. He just wanted me to, give everything the other side was asking for. And, why was I taking so long and being so obstinate? And he basically said, Janie, you got to open your kimono. And honestly, I was not the general counsel. I was literally, I think, assistant general counsel. I just started with the company. I did not bring it up. But when I did become general counsel years later, and the board and the CEO came to me and said, should we hire this investment firm again to represent us for an M&A deal? I definitely let them know then. Those are just some of the incidents that kind of, come to mind.
Cool.
Thanks for asking.
Jenny,
yes.
So those kind of incidents, do you think that person who was uttering these, is unacceptable at this today's standards, were they aware? Do you think they're aware of their insensitivity that they're saying, or just oblivious to the consequences of what they're saying? I sometimes wonder, this unconscious bias, and then as a result, they don't even understand what they're saying has meanings different meaning to other people. I'm just curious.
All of the above. I think in this case, it was the heat of the moment. It was an NDA that we were negotiating, so it did have relevance, right? he was just like, oh, like just, his whole point was we have to like entice them, get them in the door. You got to make it look attractive, to them. And, why wouldn't you want to show them everything now, to get them in the door. But yeah, he used that on the wrong person. So, so Hiro, we actually have a good question for you. What is the video game industry doing to build a strong, diverse STEAM pipeline and include more representation of AAPIs in leadership positions?
I see. Good question. So Capcom USA, the division that I work for, focuses more on sales and marketing. So they're building a STEM talent, STEM talent. STEM talent is not as important, but as a member of ESA, ESA has a ESA Foundation, which is affiliated with ESA, that provides scholarships to college students who are studying computer, game arts, and esports. So indirectly through ESA Foundation, we contribute to fostering the STEM education.
Great, thank you. So we have 5 minutes left. I do want to give everyone a chance to give closing remarks, either addressing issues that you didn't get a chance to bring up during our panel, or maybe just re-emphasizing issues that you think were really important that we already addressed. So maybe we'll start. Go ahead.
It's not so much closing remarks, but as I listened to a great conversation of our co-panelists, and I just kept thinking that some of the issues, like the math education and the Khan's observation that you were focused on doing good work and didn't pay much attention to socialize with others, communicate your result to others. Those are it's not really unique to Asian Americans. Those are like, you can say that's this kind of story that engineers in general faces, right? So I just want to finish this conversation. I wholeheartedly agree with everything, recommendation, how we approach this type of issue. But I think that these issues are not, it's not totally unique to our group, Asian American group. And I just want to just leave that thought, and that maybe there's a common theme that unite all of us, not only Asians, but maybe the engineering people. They need to focus on communication, not just Asian engineers, but engineers from all over the world. So that's just my having listened to the conversation, that was a thought that occurred to me.
Great, and I completely agree. I think a lot of what we talked about today has wider application beyond AAPI. Kwan?
Yeah, so I would challenge the audience in this moment in time that we're at, this wave, this catalyst that is facing us, and ask everyone is, what are you doing within your organization, within the bounds that you have effectiveness to ride this wave, to amplify this wave, and really to be a good ally, both for your community, your organization. You'll talk about speaking up, Hiro talking about being self-aware. I think it's important for us during this time to really contribute to this catalyst that is happening in our society. And I'll give you a personal example. It's a kind of a funny one. Is my son is 14-year-old. He is speaking back to me, giving me his opinion about life. And my first initial reaction is to tell him, no, I'm your father. I am right, which my dad would have said to me. But I have to stop and take it in and listen to him and encourage him to explore the issues and to, give more of his opinion, which drives my wife nuts. She's very traditional, right? And so I think it's a challenge for all of us me included, is how can we step out of our comfort zone beyond what we may have been taught to recognize, our behaviors, to recognize this moment in time, to be good allies to other folks, to be at the table, to speak up, and to be engaged. And particularly if you're in STEM, I'm going to be a little selfish here and plug SASE, that we'd love to connect with you. But really, the call is to be better community builders in our home, in our community, and across the areas that we can affect. So my call to action is, let's take advantage of this moment and not let it die.
That's great, Khan. Thank you. Yul?
Yeah, I know we're almost out of time, so I'll just try to be quick. There are two things that were mentioned that really resonate with me. One is, again, the importance of taking advantage of this moment. Like, this is our time. This is a community, like for our community, like there's never been this level of momentum. And so let's not waste this opportunity. Secondly, I think both Hiro and Khan mentioned the importance of allyship with other communities. Like, we have to build strong connections and relationships and support other communities just as much as we're supporting our own, because I think this is something that we're all in together. The last point out there is, and Khan, you mentioned this, for me, a lot of my perspective on this has evolved and changed ever since I became a parent. Being a parent, I realized when I was a kid, a lot of what my own aspirations and expectations were informed by what my parents did, and a lot of my own constraints and limitations I were as well. I'm trying to be cognizant of that. I've become much more active externally. I've been organizing rallies against anti-Asian hate. I've been speaking up more, in part because I want to try to model this for my own kids, because I don't want them to kind of go through the same challenges I had. I've become much more open with my own career disappointments. Like, when I feel like I've been, frustrated, or there have been times in my life where I feel like I've been the victim of unconscious bias, I've actually shared it with my kids, because I want them to see that I'm going through this, but even despite this, I feel like I need to try to do something. And I want them to feel like they don't have to be perfect. Like, things happen all the time, but it's really how you respond to these challenges that is the important thing. So I'd encourage all of you to think about that. I mean, not everyone has kids, but it's really like, do it not just for yourself, but for your community and other people who are looking to you as role models, because I think that's what we have to live up to.
Great, thank you. And with that, we're going to wrap up. I'd like to thank all of our wonderful panelists, our wonderful audience for submitting such great questions, and for watching today. We are the last panel of the day, so please tune in again tomorrow. But thank you. Take care.